Hi, this is David at TED-IELTS, the place to go for honest and reliable IELTS advice. Today I want to talk to you about IELTS Academic Writing Task 1 and specifically the biggest mistakes that people make routinely. I'm going to tell you 6 problems and then talk about how to avoid them. If you follow this advice, you should have a much better chance of getting a high band score. If you don't have time to sit through the whole video, you can see that I have divided it into chapters. You can skip ahead to the part that is most relevant or most interesting to you. However, I strongly advise watching the whole video so that you get the most benefit. Also, if you have trouble understanding everything that I say, you can turn on the subtitles below. But again, you might find it is more beneficial if you practice your listening skills by leaving them turned off. Finally, if you find this video useful, please do give it a like or consider subscribing for high-quality IELTS advice every week. Okay, let's begin today's lesson. First of all, you should be aware that there are different types of question that you could encounter in the IELTS Writing Task 1 and that you should not treat them all the same. By types of question, I mean the data that you need to describe. In the academic writing test, you could be asked to write about line graphs, bar charts, pie charts, tables, process diagrams, maps, or a mix of the first 4. The reason that you're asked to describe these things is because Task 1 is aimed at assessing how well you can use the English language to describe visual data. This is very different from Task 2, where you're required to discuss or argue a broad topic, but even within Task 1 there are several different skills that are assessed. The language used to describe a map would be very different from that used to describe a process diagram, for example, and these are both quite different from a line graph. You probably knew that already because most IELTS candidates dread being given a map to describe, and some feel equally anxious about describing process diagrams. Yet what is less well known is the fact that you need to use different language for talking about line graphs, bar charts, pie charts, and tables. Think about it. Here's a line graph taken from an old IELTS exam. How would we start describing this? Well, we need to look at the key features and changes. And in a graph like this one, the most important facts revolve around time. Whenever you see a line graph, it will show some kind of value increases or decreases over a period of time. Thus, we use words like increase or decrease, or rise and fall, and so on to describe change. We also tend to modify these for accuracy by adding some adjectives or adverbs like significant, rapidly, or slightly. That's all fine and well, but what if you transferred this language over to describing bar charts? Well, you'd be in big trouble. Bar charts may talk about changes over time, but not always, and certainly not in the same way as a line graph. Oftentimes, an IELTS bar chart will show different values from a specific moment in time. One of the most common errors here is that candidates will use language that is suitable for changes over time to describe these differences from one single point in time. This is totally incorrect and would seriously harm your score for lexical resource and task response because your vocabulary would be wrong and you would not have given the reader an accurate impression of the data. By the way, if you do want to learn how to describe a line graph, you can watch this video up here. Just open it in a new tab and then watch it after you're done with this video. Our second mistake today is attempting to describe every little detail. You might be wondering why that's a bad thing. After all, task response is about giving an accurate representation of the data. But let's look at a sample IELTS question here. It says, summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features. This clearly tells you that you're not supposed to describe every little thing. If you did, you would not have summarized or selected the main features, which means you would not have followed the instructions. This in turn means that you could not have gotten a good score for task response. In IELTS writing, as in every other part of the test, it is important to pay close attention to the instructions given, or else you could miss something important. Part of the problem here is that this instruction is the same for every IELTS Writing Task 1 question, so we just don't pay much attention to it. We assume that we broadly understand what it means. But it's worth looking back every now and then to check that we haven't forgotten the main purpose of the question, and that's to select and report the main features. Beyond that, there's also an issue that I mentioned in a video that I uploaded a fortnight ago. That's the problem of writing too much in an IELTS essay. If you were given a complicated task to describe and you attempted to write about every little detail, you might end up writing 230 or more words, which would probably take you longer than 20 minutes and might cause you to make more mistakes in terms of vocabulary or grammar. This is just another reason why describing everything could actually make your score go down. If we go back to that previous example, we can see another often overlooked part of the question. It says, make comparisons where relevant. Now this is less certain than the previous point because the phrase, when relevant, tells us that it is sometimes not necessary to make comparisons. However, this instruction tells us that we should certainly be on the lookout for comparisons, and I would suggest that there is almost always a comparison that could be made. In this line graph, for example, we can easily see that these two lines follow a very similar trend. It would be beneficial for us to draw the reader's attention towards that similarity. Conversely, a comparison is not always about similarities. It is often about contrasting information. In this bar chart, for example, we can see a huge disparity between the United States and South Korea in terms of electricity usage. It doesn't necessarily have to be the highest and the lowest thing. Sometimes there is a big gap between the country with the most of something and the next country on that list. And you might want to highlight that. A rule of thumb is, if it is easily noticeable, you should probably mention it. Doing this is quite important because it shows that you can analyze the data intelligently and then use careful language to explain it to your reader. This can be quite a challenge in terms of your thinking and English skills, and it is important that you refer back to my first point about not treating bar charts and line graphs the same. A line graph is likely to highlight changes in terms of time, so you might talk about one set of values rising more rapidly than another. Whereas in a bar chart, it would simply be that one is higher than the other. Indeed, when it comes to comparisons, you really need to think carefully. Most maps that you encounter will require comparisons as the main focus of the essay. You will typically be given two maps, and so you'll need to discuss the ways in which they differ. Process diagrams, on the other hand, will most likely not include any sort of comparison, so you would not need any comparative language here at all. You probably know that to get a high score in IELTS Writing Task 2, you need to use paragraphs, and you have probably learned several basic essay structures. However, structure is also important for Task 1 essays. It is harder to learn because you can't easily learn a set structure that can be adapted for all answers, but you can pick up some basic principles to help you make smart choices. What I want to say here is that you must logically group your data. That means whenever you look at a Task 1 question, whether it's a line graph or a process diagram or anything else, you must immediately begin to divide it into groups. These groups will eventually become your paragraphs. There are many ways that this can be done, so let's look at some examples so that you can better understand what I mean. To go back to our previous line graph example, we might want to write one paragraph about the UK and Sweden, and then another paragraph about Italy and Portugal. This is logical because these two groups follow very loosely similar patterns. We could do the same here by discussing the total number of tourists in one paragraph and then the different types of tourists in a second paragraph. Another way is to divide the timeline into sections. You can group all of the lines together for the first half and describe them, then talk about how they diverge after that. This tends to work well when the data is quite similar at first and different later, or when there aren't obviously similar trends to group. For process diagrams, you can take the same approach and divide the whole process into 2 or 3 sections, choosing a logical point at which to split it. Whilst for maps, you're usually given 2 to describe, so you can have one paragraph that talks about the first map and another that talks about the second map. This is really nice because you can put lots of detail into the first paragraph to show how well you can use prepositions and other elements for describing spatial layout. And in the second part, you can show off your language for highlighting comparisons and change over time. By the way, I wrote a very useful article about how to structure an IELTS Writing Task 1 essay that you can find at TED-IELTS.com. It goes into much more detail than I could possibly give here, so I'll put the link down below. Previously, I mentioned a structure for describing maps. I said that you should use one paragraph for giving a description of the physical layout of a place, and then another that shows how it changed. This is because maps usually show the same location but at different times. It could be one in the past and one in the present, or one in the present and one in the future. In any case, it is very important to use your verb tenses to adequately reflect this. Let's look at an example. Here we can see 2 maps. One shows the past and one shows the present. If we want to show how things have changed, then we're going to rely heavily on the present perfect tense. That's because the present perfect is used for things that began in the past, but when the time period concerned leads up to the present. For example, the farmland has been replaced by a golf course. Notice that I used the present perfect, but in the passive voice. That's because we don't know who turned the farmland into a golf course. If we did, we could use the more straightforward active voice. A team of developers has replaced the farmland with a golf course. However, for a task like this, we would never be told who was responsible for doing the verb, so passive voice is actually very common. Of course, we don't need to stick to that one tense, and sometimes it's inappropriate. If we know something happened and finished in the past, we should use the past simple. If we wanted to emphasize the fact that the farmland was converted into a golf course in the past, rather than highlighting it as one example of a wider period of change, we might say the farmland was replaced by a golf course. When one of the maps shows the future, we would of course need to totally change our verb tenses. In this case, we're looking at the future, but obviously it is just a plan, so we need to use language carefully to show that it is not guaranteed that something will happen. We might say something like, a leisure pool is expected to be built in place of one set of outdoor courts. However, if we make it clear throughout the essay that this is just a plan, we can sometimes use more confident language and slip into the future simple tense. A cafe and a sports shop will be built by the entrance. Verb tense is really important for all types of question, and you absolutely must think about the time period that is given. One of the biggest mistakes that I regularly see when marking essays is the use of present simple tense when people are talking about line graph or table data from the past. For example, here the latest data comes from 2002, which is far in the past, but people often say things like almost twice as many minutes are spent on local calls than international ones. We need to be much more careful about picking a verb tense, as this sort of mistake would have a terrible impact on your score for grammatical range and accuracy. Finally, you absolutely must not add extra information or opinions to your IELTS Writing Task 1 essays. I cannot stress this enough. Every week I have 2 or 3 new students who describe a line graph or a bar chart that involves some sort of price increase, and they write something like, the price increased because of a shortage of blah blah blah. This is not what you're asked to do. Remember the task description. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting main features. It doesn't say anything about giving your ideas. If you include the words I think or because in your Task 1 essay, then you've done something wrong. Instead, remember that you're asked to write a description of the information in front of you. That's all. Just write down what you can see and don't add anything else. The examiner doesn't want to know your feelings or your insights about the data. They don't want any historical background or anything else. That's all stuff you can do in Task 2 if you want. For Task 1, you're given a totally different challenge, and if you try to stuff your opinion into it, you will not have succeeded in doing what you were told. It is important when we do IELTS to know what the purpose of the test is. Overall, of course, it's an English test, but each part of the exam tests a different part of your skills. For IELTS Writing Task 1, you need to be able to understand the data in front of you and then present it for a reader in a way that is easily understood. Imagine that the reader cannot see your chart or diagram or map. Could you tell them what it looks like and have them successfully picture it in their mind? That's the challenge. To do that, you need to pick up the most important data, use the most accurate language, and group your ideas logically, and nothing else. I have in-depth guides to all Task 1 question types on my website. I'll list them down below so that you can take a look if you have the time. They're filled with useful advice and sample answers that can help you to better understand this task. Once you come to understand what you need to do, it is not actually as difficult as you might think, and you can begin working towards writing amazing essays that can help you get a high band score.